The morning mist clung to the jagged rocks of Mount Karadağ like ghostly fingers, obscuring the treacherous paths that wound through the ancient peaks of northern Montenegro. Sergeant Elena Vasquez pressed her body against the cold granite, feeling the weight of her M249 Squad Automatic Weapon cutting into her shoulder as she peered through the pre-dawn darkness. The silence was unnatural, broken only by the distant echo of her own breathing and the soft rustle of wind through the sparse mountain vegetation. 20 meters below her position, the narrow valley stretched like a wound between the towering cliffs, its floor littered with the debris of centuries of rockfalls and the occasional glint of metal from abandoned mining equipment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This was the Halavika Gorge, a place local legends claimed was cursed, where even the bravest shepherds refused to graze their flocks. Now it would become the stage for what Elena feared might be her final battle. She adjusted her grip on the machine gun, her calloused fingers finding the familiar grooves worn smooth by countless training sessions. 3 years of deployment in the Balkans had taught her to read the mountain's moods, to sense danger in the way shadows fell and birds fled their roosts. This morning, every instinct screamed that death was approaching through the mist. The radio crackled to life on her shoulder, startling her from her surveillance. Lieutenant Marcus Chen's voice carried the tension of a man who had slept poorly and awakened to worse news. "Bravo team, this is Overwatch. Status report." Elena keyed her radio, keeping her voice low despite the apparent emptiness of the gorge. "Below, Overwatch, this is Bravo 1. No movement detected. Visibility limited by morning fog. Estimated burn-off in 30 minutes. She paused, studying the mist patterns that seemed to swirl with unnatural purpose. "Sir, something feels wrong about this place." Chun's response came after a longer pause than normal. "Copy that, Bravo 1. Maintain Overwatch position. Intelligence indicates target package should be moving through your sector within the hour." Another pause, then his voice dropped to something approaching confidential. "Elena, I need you to know that this mission parameters changed overnight. We're not just doing reconnaissance anymore." The words hit Elena like ice water in her veins. Mission parameter changes in the field usually meant one of two things. Either the situation had deteriorated beyond original expectations, or someone higher up the chain of command had decided that the original mission wasn't aggressive enough. Neither possibility boded well for the 8 soldiers currently positioned throughout the gorge. "What kind of changes, sir?" Elena asked, though part of her already suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "We've been tasked with interdiction. The target package contains weapons-grade materials that cannot be allowed to reach their destination. Rules of engagement have been updated to weapons-free." Chun's voice carried the weight of a man delivering orders he didn't fully believe in. "Elena, this is no longer a surveillance mission. We're here to stop a convoy by any means necessary." Elena felt her stomach tighten. Weapons-grade materials could mean anything from conventional explosives to chemical weapons to something far worse. The intelligence briefings had been deliberately vague, focusing on the strategic importance of the interdiction rather than the specific nature of the threat. But in her experience, when intelligence officers were vague about details, it usually meant the details were either classified beyond their clearance level or terrifying enough to compromise mission effectiveness if shared with field personnel. She shifted position slightly, using her scope to scan the approaches to the gorge. The mist was beginning to thin, revealing more of the treacherous terrain that would funnel any vehicle convoy through a kill zone barely 50 meters wide at its narrowest point. The positioning was tactically sound for an ambush, which made her wonder how much of this mission had been planned versus how much was being improvised in response to developing intelligence. "Sir, what's our extraction plan if this goes sideways?" Elena asked. It was a question every experienced soldier learned to ask before accepting a mission that might not have a clean exit strategy. Chen's silence stretched long enough that Elena began to wonder if her radio had malfunctioned. When he finally responded, his voice carried a note she had never heard before in 3 years of serving under his command. Extraction is contingent on mission success. Primary exfiltration route is back through the mountain passes to the rendezvous point. Secondary route is, he paused again. There is no secondary route, Elena. This gorge is the only way in or out for 20 kilometers. In any direction. The implications hit Elena immediately. They were being positioned not just to intercept a convoy, but to hold a position that offered no tactical withdrawal options. In military terms, they were being deployed as a blocking force with no expectation of survival if the mission went wrong. The question was whether Chen knew this when he accepted the mission parameters, or whether he was discovering it at the same time she was. Understood, sir. Elena kept her voice professional despite the growing sense of unease. Bravo team is in position and ready to execute on your command. As she ended the radio conversation, Elena became aware of movement in her peripheral vision. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was making her way carefully along the ridgeline, using hand signals to communicate her approach. Santos had been Elena's closest friend since their deployment began, a steady presence whose tactical instincts had kept their unit alive through a dozen dangerous missions. If Santos was moving from her assigned position, it meant she had discovered something that couldn't wait for scheduled communications. Santos reached Elena's position and immediately dropped into cover behind the same granite outcropping. Her face was flushed from exertion, but her eyes carried the sharp focus of a soldier who had seen something that changed everything. "Elena, we need to talk," Santos whispered, pulling out a handheld GPS device that showed the positions of all friendly forces in the area. "I've been monitoring radio traffic from the other teams, and something doesn't add up about this mission." Elena turned away from her scope to focus on her friend. "What kind of something?" Santos pointed to the GPS display, highlighting the positions of the other 6 soldiers scattered throughout the gorge. "Look at our deployment pattern. We're not positioned for an interdiction mission. We're positioned for a last stand defense." She traced her finger along the tactical positions. Every fighting position has overlapping fields of fire designed to channel an attacking force into a kill zone, but there's no provision for withdrawal or maneuver. Elena studied the display and felt her unease crystallize into genuine concern. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Santos was right. Their positioning was textbook defensive warfare, designed to hold ground at all costs rather than to intercept and withdraw. Maybe intelligence expects heavier resistance than they briefed us about. "That's what I thought initially," Santos replied. "But then I started thinking about the weapons-grade materials Chen mentioned. Elena, what if we're not here to stop those materials from reaching their destination? What if we're here to ensure that anyone who tries to retrieve them doesn't survive to report what they found?" The possibility sent a chill through Elena. That had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're suggesting this is a cleanup operation?" Santos nodded grimly. "I'm suggesting that we might be the expendable assets in someone else's larger operation. Think about it. 8 soldiers in an isolated mountain gorge with no extraction plan and orders to engage targets carrying weapons-grade materials. If something goes wrong, there's no one to report what really happened here." Elena felt the weight of the machine gun suddenly become oppressive. She had carried this weapon through countless missions, trusting that her commanders had placed her in positions where her skills could make a difference in achieving legitimate military objectives. The possibility that she might be nothing more than a disposable chess piece in someone else's game was almost too disturbing to contemplate. "Maria, even if you're right, what can we do? We have orders and we have a mission to complete." Santos was quiet for a moment, scanning the approaches to their position. We follow orders, but we also watch each other's backs. And if this mission starts going sideways, we make sure that someone survives to report what really happened here. She pulled out a small digital recorder and showed it to Elena. I've been documenting everything since we arrived. Radio traffic, deployment orders, tactical positions. If we don't make it out, maybe someone will find this and piece together the truth. Elena felt a surge of affection for her friend, mixed with a growing sense of dread about what they might be walking into. You think someone's setting us up? I think someone's using us for a purpose we weren't briefed about. Whether that's malicious or just compartmentalized operational security, I don't know. But I know that good soldiers don't get deployed to positions like this without very specific reasons. Before Elena could respond, her radio crackled again. This time it was Corporal Jennifer Walsh, positioned on the opposite ridge with a clear view of the northern approach to the gorge. All units, this is Bravo 3. I have vehicles approaching from the north. Estimated 6 vehicles, military configuration. Range approximately 2 kilometers and closing. Elena immediately shifted back to her scope, scanning the northern approach through the thinning mist. She could barely make out the dust cloud kicked up by the approaching convoy, but Walsh's elevated position would give her a much clearer view of the threat. Bravo 3, can you identify vehicle types? Chen's voice carried the sudden tension of a mission transitioning from waiting to active engagement. Overwatch, I'm seeing what looks like 4 armored personnel carriers and 2 supply trucks. No visible escort vehicles, but these APCs look heavily armed. Walsh's voice remained calm despite the implications of her report. Sir, this is a lot more firepower than intelligence led us to expect. Elena felt her mouth go dry. 4 armored personnel carriers could easily contain 40 to 50 armed soldiers. Far more than 8 scattered defenders could hope to engage successfully. If those vehicles were carrying the weapons-grade materials Chen had mentioned, they would also be motivated to fight through any opposition rather than risk having their cargo fall into hostile hands. Santos caught Elena's eye and mouthed silently. Told you. Chen's voice came through the radio with the crisp authority of a commander making tactical decisions in real time. All Bravo units, prepare for engagement. Target priority is the supply trucks. We need to stop that cargo from leaving this gorge. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a note of finality. Remember, this is a weapons-free environment. Anything that moves in that convoy is considered hostile. Elena positioned herself behind her machine gun and began calculating fields of fire and ammunition requirements. The M249 carried a 200-round box magazine with additional ammunition in her pack for sustained engagement. If the convoy attempted to fight through their position, she would be responsible for covering the most likely avenue of approach for infantry dismounting from the armored vehicles. The sound of engines grew louder as the convoy approached the mouth of the gorge. Elena could now see individual vehicles through her scope, noting the heavy armor plating and the multiple weapon systems mounted on each APC. These were not the lightly armed transport vehicles she had expected based on the mission briefing. These were combat vehicles configured for serious warfare. Bravo 1, this is Overwatch. You have the best position to initiate contact. On my command, you will engage the lead vehicle to halt the convoy in the kill zone. Elena felt her heart rate spike as the moment of engagement approached. She had been in firefights before, but never in a situation where the tactical odds were so clearly stacked against her unit. The approaching convoy represented overwhelming firepower and manpower, while her team was scattered across defensive positions with no hope of reinforcement or extraction. Copy, Overwatch. Bravo 1. Ready to engage on your command. The convoy entered the narrow portion of the gorge, and Elena could see armed soldiers visible in the turrets of each APC. Their weapons were not just pointed forward in a travel configuration. They were actively scanning for threats, suggesting that the convoy was expecting potential resistance. This was not a routine cargo transport. This was a combat mission moving through hostile territory. Santos tapped Elena's shoulder and pointed toward the second supply truck. Through the scope, Elena could see what had caught her friend's attention. The truck's cargo area was covered with heavy canvas, but the shape underneath suggested cylindrical containers rather than conventional weapons or supplies. If those were the weapons-grade materials they had been sent to intercept, Elena wondered what kind of materials required such heavy security and such extreme measures to prevent their capture. All Bravo units, stand by for engagement, Chen commanded. Bravo 1, you have green light to engage lead vehicle in 3, 2, 1, execute. Elena squeezed the trigger and felt the familiar buck of the machine gun as it sent a stream of rounds toward the lead. A PC. The tracers lit up the morning air like deadly fireflies, and she watched as her rounds sparked off the vehicle's armor plating without apparent effect. The convoy immediately halted, and soldiers began dismounting from the APCs with the fluid precision of experienced combat troops. The gorge erupted in gunfire as the other members of Bravo team opened fire from their positions. Elena could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire, mixed with the heavier reports of machine guns and the occasional explosion of a grenade. But almost immediately, it became clear that their small arms fire was having minimal effect on the heavily armored vehicles. The convoy's response was swift and overwhelming. The APC turrets swiveled to ridgelines where Bravo team was positioned, and Elena heard the distinctive whine of incoming heavy weapons fire, the granite around. Her position exploded in a shower of rock fragments as large caliber rounds struck the cliff face. All units, this is Overwatch. Take cover and maintain suppressive fire. Chen's voice carried the strain of a commander watching his tactical situation deteriorate rapidly. Elena ducked behind her granite shelter as more heavy rounds chewed up the rocks around her position. She could hear Santos returning fire with her rifle, but the sound was almost lost in the growing volume of incoming fire from the convoy below. Through a gap in the rocks, Elena could see soldiers spreading out from the APCs and beginning to advance up the slopes toward their positions. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They were not just facing a convoy carrying weapons-grade materials. They were facing a military unit that had been prepared for exactly this kind of engagement. The armor, the weapons, the tactical response, everything suggested that this convoy had been expecting an ambush and had come equipped to fight through it. Maria, Elena called to Santos, we need to fall back to secondary positions. What? Secondary positions? Santos shouted back over the gunfire. Chen said there wasn't a secondary plan. Elena felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. They had been placed in a position designed to channel them into a fight they couldn't win, with no exit strategy and no support. Whether through incompetence or design, someone had sent 8 soldiers to face overwhelming odds in an isolated mountain gorge. Her radio crackled with Walsh's voice, now strained with obvious stress. Overwatch, this is Bravo 3. I'm taking heavy fire and need immediate support. These guys have mortar. The mention of mortar sent a chill through Elena. Mortar meant the convoy could engage their positions with indirect fire, negating the advantage of their elevated defensive positions. She looked at Santos and saw her own realization reflected in her friend's eyes. They were in serious trouble. Bravo 3, maintain your position. Chen's response carried the tone of a commander whose options were rapidly disappearing. All units, focus fire on the supply trucks. We cannot allow that cargo to escape. Elena repositioned her machine gun and tried to acquire a clear shot at the supply trucks, but the advancing infantry was forcing her to engage closer targets to prevent being overrun. She could see at least a dozen soldiers moving up the slope toward her position, using the terrain and their own suppressive fire to close the distance. Santos crawled over to Elena's position, staying low as bullets whined overhead. "Elena, I think we need to consider the possibility that this mission was never intended to succeed." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we were sent here to die. Maybe someone wanted to ensure that whatever's in those trucks stays secret, and the best way to do that was to sacrifice a small team in a hopeless engagement." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're talking about our own command setting us up. I'm talking about the possibility that this mission serves purposes we weren't briefed about. Think about it, Elena. 8 soldiers against a heavily armed convoy in an isolated location with no extraction. Plan. Either someone seriously underestimated the threat, or someone wanted to ensure there were no witnesses to whatever happens here." Before Elena could respond, an explosion erupted from Walsh's position on the opposite ridge. Through her scope, Elena could see smoke rising from the rocks where Bravo 3 had been located. "Bravo 3, report." Chen's voice carried desperate urgency. Silence. "Walsh, do you copy?" More silence, punctuated by the continuing gunfire from the convoy below. Elena felt rage building alongside her fear. Jennifer Walsh was 19 years old, barely 6 months into her first deployment. If Santos was right about the nature of this mission, Walsh had just died for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate military objectives. "Overwatch, this is Bravo 1, Elena called into her radio. "I'm seeing heavy casualties and no tactical advantage. Request permission to withdraw to defensible positions." Chen's response was immediate and final. "Negative, Bravo 1, mission. Parameters require holding current positions. Continue engagement of target vehicles." Elena stared at her radio in disbelief. Chen was ordering them to maintain positions that were clearly untenable, against overwhelming odds, with no hope of mission success. It was the kind of order that got soldiers killed for no strategic gain. Santos grabbed Elena's arm. "That settles it. We're being sacrificed for someone else's agenda." Elena looked down at the convoy below and made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. If she was going to die in this gorge, she was going to die fighting for her soldiers rather than for whatever hidden agenda had brought them here. "Maria, gather whoever you can reach on the radio. We're going to execute a fighting withdrawal whether Chen likes it or not." "Elena, that's disobeying direct orders." "Maria, those orders are going to get us all killed for no good reason. I'd rather face a court-martial than watch my soldiers die because someone decided we were expendable." Elena keyed her radio and broadcast to all Bravo team members. "All Bravo units, this is Bravo 1. I am taking tactical command. Prepare for immediate withdrawal to Rally Point Alpha. Anyone who can move, start moving now." Chen's voice exploded through the radio. "Bravo 1, you are not authorized to assume. Command, return to your position and continue mission execution." Elena turned off her radio and looked at Santos. "From this point on, we're on our own." The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time since arriving in the gorge, Elena felt like she was acting in the best interests of her soldiers, rather than blindly following orders that made no tactical sense. Whatever the consequences, she would face them knowing that she had tried to save the lives of the people under her command. Santos nodded grimly. "What's the plan?" Elena studied the terrain around their position, looking for routes that would allow her team to withdraw while maintaining some ability to suppress the advancing convoy forces. The gorge offered limited options, but there were secondary ridgelines that could provide covered withdrawal routes if they could reach them. "We're going to leapfrog back through the secondary positions, using suppressive fire to cover each movement. The goal is to get everyone out of this kill zone and to a position where we can either call for extraction or make our way back to friendly lines on foot. And if Chen tries to stop us? Elena felt a cold determination settle over her. Then Chen is going to discover that his authority ends where the safety of my soldiers begins. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, another mortar round exploded near their position, showering them with rock fragments and demonstrating that the convoy forces were systematically targeting each defensive position with increasingly accurate fire. Elena grabbed her machine gun and prepared to move. Maria, pass the word to anyone you can reach. We're moving in 60 seconds whether they're ready or not. Santos began calling the other team members on the radio, using emergency frequencies to coordinate the withdrawal. Elena could hear responses from 3 other soldiers, but ominous silence from the positions where Walsh and 2 others had been located. As Elena prepared to begin the most dangerous movement of her military career, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had been inevitable from the beginning. Someone had sent them into an impossible situation, and now she would have to choose between following orders that would get her soldiers killed and taking actions that would define her as either a hero or a traitor. The choice, when it came down to it, was easier than she had expected. Elena Vasquez was a soldier, and soldiers protected each other. Everything else was someone else's problem. The first withdrawal movement under fire was chaos. Elena provided, covering fire while Santos and Corporal David Rodriguez scrambled across 30 meters of exposed ridgeline toward the secondary position. The machine gun bucked against her shoulder as she sent sustained bursts toward the advancing convoy forces. Watching her tracers spark off armored vehicles and force infantry to seek cover behind boulders. Rodriguez made it to cover, but Elena could see blood seeping through his uniform sleeve where shrapnel had found its mark. Santos reached the rally point and immediately began setting up a defensive position to cover Elena's movement. The coordination was instinctive, born from months of training and combat experience, but Elena knew they were fighting against overwhelming odds with diminishing ammunition. Her radio crackled with Chen's voice, now carrying barely controlled rage. Bravo 1. You are in direct violation of orders. Return to your position immediately or face court-martial. Elena ignored the transmission and signaled Santos that she was ready to move. The sprint across open ground felt like an eternity, with bullets whining past her head and the heavy thump of her machine gun and equipment making every step a struggle. She dove into cover beside Santos just as a mortar round exploded where her original position had been. 3 more soldiers responded to the withdrawal call, Santos reported breathlessly. But I lost contact with Murphy and Harrison. Their positions took direct hits. Elena felt grief and anger warring in her chest. Timothy Murphy was 22 years old with a wife and infant daughter back in Ohio. Jake Harrison had been planning to propose to his girlfriend when he returned from deployment. Both were likely dead because someone had decided their lives were acceptable losses in pursuit of unknown objectives. Who else made it out? Elena asked while scanning the terrain for their next movement route. Rodriguez, obviously. Also, Sergeant Kim and Private Foster. That's 5 of us still mobile, but Rodriguez is wounded and Kim's radio got damaged. We're running low on everything except enemies. Elena studied the tactical situation. 5 soldiers with limited ammunition against a convoy that had demonstrated superior firepower and numbers. The smart move would be to continue withdrawing until they could reach a position where they could call for extraction or evade contact entirely. But as she watched through her scope, Elena saw something that changed everything. The convoy had stopped systematic suppression of their former positions and was now focused on the supply trucks. Soldiers were unloading cylindrical containers from the vehicles with careful precision, handling them as if they contained something far more dangerous than conventional weapons. One soldier dropped a container, and Elena watched through her scope as his entire squad immediately moved away from the area, as if expecting an explosion or contamination. "Maria, look at this," Elena whispered, handing Santos the scope. Tell me what you see. Santos observed the activity below for several minutes before lowering the scope with a troubled expression. Those aren't conventional weapons containers. The way they're handling them, the protective equipment some of the soldiers are wearing, the decontamination procedures. Elena, I think those containers hold chemical or biological weapons. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. If the convoy was transporting weapons of mass destruction, then the mission parameters made terrible sense. 8 soldiers had been positioned not to intercept the weapons, but to serve as witnesses to their destruction. The weapons-grade materials Chen had mentioned weren't cargo to be captured. They were evidence to be eliminated along with anyone who might report their existence. Elena's mind raced through the implications. Someone had decided that chemical or biological weapons were being transported through this area, and rather than risk political complications from an official interdiction, they had sent a small team to discover the weapons and eliminate them in what would appear to be a tragic but heroic last stand. The soldiers would be posthumously decorated for their sacrifice, and the weapons would be destroyed with no inconvenient questions about their origin or intended destination. "We need to get out of here," Santos said urgently. "If those are chemical weapons and they detonate them, this entire gorge becomes a death trap." But Elena was thinking beyond immediate survival. If Santos was right about the nature of the cargo, then someone was planning to use weapons of mass destruction, and the only people in position to report this were currently being hunted through a mountain gorge. The withdrawal she had initiated to save her soldiers might be the only thing standing between a war crime and its successful cover-up. Her radio suddenly crackled with a new voice, one she didn't recognize. "All Bravo units, this is Colonel Patricia Blackwood, Joint Special Operations Command. Respond immediately." Elena looked at Santos uncertainly. Blackwood's name wasn't in any of their operational briefings, and Joint Special Operations Command didn't typically communicate directly with field units. But the authority in the woman's voice suggested someone far above Chun's pay grade. Elena keyed her radio cautiously. "This is Bravo 1. Identify yourself and state your authority." "Bravo 1, I am Colonel Blackwood, and I am currently tracking your unit's engagement through satellite surveillance. I need you to understand that your current mission has been compromised by hostile intelligence, and Lieutenant Chun's orders do not reflect current operational requirements." Elena felt confusion mixing with her anger. "Ma'am, are you saying that Chun's orders were incorrect?" "I'm saying that Chun's orders were based on intelligence that we now know was deliberately falsified to place your unit in an untenable position. Bravo 1, you and your team have stumbled into the middle of an operation designed to eliminate witnesses to illegal weapons trafficking." Santos grabbed Elena's arm, her eyes wide with understanding. "She's confirming what we suspected. Someone set us up." Blackwood's voice continued with urgent authority. "Bravo 1, the convoy you're engaging is not carrying weapons-grade materials for elimination. They're carrying stolen chemical weapons for delivery to terrorist organizations. Your orders to engage were designed to ensure that your unit would be eliminated before you could report the true nature of the cargo." Elena felt rage building in her chest. "Ma'am, are you telling me that our own command sent us here to die?" "I'm telling you that hostile intelligence services have penetrated our operational planning, and your unit was selected for elimination because your position allowed observation of activities that certain parties wanted to remain secret." The implications were staggering. Elena looked around at her remaining soldiers, all of whom were listening to the radio conversation with growing comprehension. They had been betrayed not just by enemy action, but by someone within their own command structure, who had decided their lives were expendable in service of covering up war crimes. "Colonel, what are your orders?" Elena asked, though part of her was no longer sure she trusted any orders coming through official channels. "My orders are to preserve your unit's lives and to ensure that evidence of this weapons trafficking operation reaches Appropriate authorities. The convoy must not be allowed to complete its delivery, but your primary mission is now survival and documentation. Santos pulled out her recording device and showed it to Elena. We've been documenting everything since we arrived. If we can get out of here with this evidence. Elena felt a sense of purpose crystallizing beyond immediate survival. They weren't just fighting to escape a bad tactical situation. They were fighting to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command. The withdrawal she had initiated to save her soldiers' lives had become a mission to prevent weapons of mass destruction from reaching terrorist organizations. Colonel Blackwood, what support can you provide? I'm working to coordinate extraction. But you need to understand that some of the people involved in this conspiracy have the authority to interfere with rescue operations. Your best chance of survival is to continue evading contact while gathering evidence of the weapons trafficking. Elena looked down at the convoy below, now seeing it in an entirely different light. Instead of a legitimate military operation that her unit had been sent to intercept, she was looking at criminals transporting stolen weapons to terrorists. With her unit positioned as convenient scapegoats to cover up the crime, Rodriguez crawled over to their position, clutching his wounded arm. Sergeant, I heard the radio traffic. Are we really dealing with our own people trying to kill us? Elena met the young corporal's eyes and saw fear mixed with betrayal. Dave, I think we're dealing with people who have decided that keeping secrets is more important than keeping soldiers alive. But we're going to get out of here, and we're going to make sure the truth comes out. Kim and Foster reached their position after a dangerous crawl across exposed terrain. Both looked exhausted and worried, but they carried extra ammunition. And Foster had managed to salvage a radio from one of the compromised positions. Sergeant, what's our situation? Kim asked, settling into cover beside the group. Elena looked at her remaining soldiers and felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders. 5 soldiers against a heavily armed convoy with unknown enemies. Among their own command structure, in an isolated mountain gorge with limited escape routes. On paper, it was a hopeless situation. But Elena had survived 3 years of combat by refusing to accept hopeless situations. Our situation is that we've uncovered evidence of war crimes, and there are people who want to kill us to keep that evidence secret. Our mission is to survive long enough to get this information to people who can act on it. Foster, barely 19 and on his first deployment, looked confused. Sergeant, are we still following orders? Elena considered the question carefully. Private, we're following the most important order any soldier can follow. Protect innocent lives from people who would harm them. Everything else is politics. The radio crackled again with Blackwood's voice. Bravo 1, satellite surveillance shows the convoy preparing to move. They've completed loading the containers and appear to be preparing for departure. If those weapons reach their destination, we're looking at potential terrorist attacks that could kill thousands of people. Elena felt the weight of impossible choices. Her primary responsibility was to her soldiers, to get them out of this situation alive. But if the convoy escaped with chemical weapons, the consequences could be catastrophic. She looked at her team and saw the same realization in their eyes. Santos spoke first. Elena, we can't let those weapons reach terrorists, even if it means taking risks. Kim nodded grimly. My sister lives in New York. If those weapons are used against civilians. Elena understood the choice her soldiers were making. They were volunteering to risk their lives not for military objectives or political goals, but to prevent mass casualties among innocent people. It was the kind of decision that defined soldiers as something more than just people who followed orders. All right, Elena said, feeling resolve crystallize into purpose. We're going to stop that convoy. But we're going to do it smart, and we're all going to survive to see those responsible held accountable. She studied the terrain below. looking for tactical advantages that could allow 5 soldiers to neutralize a convoy without direct confrontation. The gorge offered limited options, but Elena began to see possibilities that wouldn't require them to engage in a hopeless firefight. The convoy has to exit through the southern pass, she told her team. That's a narrow choke point with steep walls on both sides. If we can create a rock slide at the right moment, we can trap the vehicles in the gorge and prevent the weapons from reaching their destination. Rodriguez looked skeptical despite his willingness to continue the mission. Sergeant, how do we create a rock slide without explosives? Elena pointed to a section of the gorge wall that showed signs of recent weathering and loose rock. The mountain does most of the work for us. We just need to apply pressure at the right points with what ammunition we have left. Foster looked up from checking his weapon. What about the soldiers with the convoy? If we trap them, they'll still be armed and dangerous. Elena felt the weight of tactical planning under impossible constraints. Our goal is to stop the weapons from reaching their destination, not to eliminate every threat. If we can disable their vehicles and document their cargo, extraction forces can deal with the personnel. Santos was studying the convoy through her scope. Elena, I count approximately 40 soldiers down there, most with heavy weapons. Even if we stop the vehicles, they're not going to just surrender. Elena knew Santos was right, but she also knew that direct confrontation with overwhelming enemy forces was certain suicide. Their only advantage was position and the element of surprise, both of which would be lost in a sustained firefight. We're going to hit them fast and disappear, Elena decided. Create the rock slide, document what we can, and then withdraw to a position where we can coordinate with Colonel Blackwood for extraction. Kim was monitoring radio frequencies on their salvaged equipment. Sergeant, I'm picking up communications from the convoy. They're planning to move out in 15 minutes, and they're coordinating with someone outside the gorge about their schedule. Elena felt time pressure adding to the already overwhelming tactical challenges. 15 minutes to position her team, initiate the rock slide, and gather evidence before the convoy could escape with weapons that might be used to kill thousands of innocent people. All right, people, this is it, Elena announced to her team. Rodriguez, you're going to provide overwatch from this position. Your arm makes you the least mobile, but you can still provide covering fire if we need it. Kim and Foster, you're with Santos to set up the rock slide. I'm going to move closer to the convoy to document the weapons. Rodriguez looked unhappy about being left behind. Sergeant, my arm's not that bad. I can still move with the team. Elena put her hand on the young corporal's shoulder. Dave, someone needs to maintain communications with Colonel Blackwood and coordinate extraction. When this is over, that's a crucial mission, and I need someone I trust. The explanation satisfied Rodriguez's need to contribute while acknowledging his physical limitations. Elena had learned that good soldiers needed to feel that their sacrifices served important purposes, even when those purposes weren't the ones they had originally expected. Santos was already preparing to move. Elena, we need to time this perfectly. If the convoy starts moving before we trigger the slide, we lose our chance. Elena checked her watch and began calculating movement times and coordination requirements. 12 minutes to get into position. Signal when you're ready to trigger the slide, and I'll signal when I have clear documentation of the weapons. Foster looked nervous but determined. Sergeant, what if this doesn't work? Elena met the young private's eyes and saw her own fears reflected there. Then we'll figure out something else. But Foster, failing isn't an option when the alternative is letting terrorists get their hands on chemical weapons. As her team prepared to move, Elena felt the weight of command in a way she had never experienced before. She was leading soldiers into a situation that might get them all killed, based on her judgment about intelligence she couldn't verify, in pursuit of objectives that went far beyond their original mission parameters. But as she looked at her soldiers, Elena saw something that gave her confidence. They weren't following her because of military rank or because of orders from distant commanders. They were following her because they trusted her judgment and because they believed in the mission she had defined for them. Elena Vasquez had become the kind of leader she had always respected. Someone who made decisions based on protecting innocent lives rather than advancing careers or following politics. The next 15 minutes would determine whether that leadership was enough to prevent a catastrophe that could change the course of international terrorism forever. Elena shouldered her machine gun and prepared to move toward the most dangerous position of her military career, knowing that failure would mean not just her death and the deaths of her soldiers, but potentially the deaths of thousands of innocent civilians who would never know how close they had come to a terrorist attack with weapons of mass destruction. The mountain mist was clearing completely now, leaving no cover except speed, stealth, and the kind of tactical audacity that separated good soldiers from legends. Elena Vasquez was about to discover which category defined her. Elena's approach to the convoy required crossing 200 meters of broken terrain while staying invisible to 40 armed soldiers. She moved like her instructors had taught her during advanced reconnaissance training, using every boulder and depression to mask her movement. The weight of her machine gun made stealth challenging, but Elena knew she might need the firepower if her infiltration was discovered. The convoy had formed a defensive perimeter while loading the final containers, but their attention was focused outward toward the ridgelines where Bravo team had originally been positioned. Elena exploited this tactical blind spot, moving through a dry stream that offered concealment while bringing her within 50 meters of the supply trucks. Through her scope, Elena could see the containers more clearly now. Each cylinder bore markings in Cyrillic script, along with international chemical hazard symbols that confirmed Santos's assessment. These were definitely chemical weapons, and the careful handling procedures the convoy was using suggested they contained lethal agents rather than riot control compounds. Elena activated her radio's recording function and began documenting everything she could observe: container markings, soldier uniforms and equipment, vehicle identification numbers, and most importantly, conversations she could overhear between convoy personnel. If she didn't survive the next hour, at least there would be evidence of what had been discovered here. The radio crackled softly with Santos's voice. Overwatch, Team 2 in position for rockslide initiation, standing by for your signal. Elena keyed her radio once to acknowledge without speaking. She was close enough now that any sound might alert the convoy to her presence. Through her scope, she could see a convoy officer speaking into a satellite phone, apparently coordinating with someone outside the immediate area about timing and logistics. Suddenly, Elena heard something that made her blood freeze. The officer was speaking in accented English, and she could make out enough words to understand that he was reporting to someone about eliminating witnesses and maintaining operational security. The conversation confirmed Colonel Blackwood's assessment that the convoy was aware of Bravo team's presence and had specific orders to ensure no survivors reported what they had seen. Elena began photographing everything within range using a small digital camera that had been standard equipment for reconnaissance missions. The images would provide crucial evidence of the weapons trafficking, assuming she could survive to deliver them to appropriate authorities. Her radio whispered, again with Rodriguez's voice from the overwatch position. Bravo 1, new vehicles approaching from the south. 2 additional APCs, approximately 10 minutes out. Elena felt her tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. The convoy was already overwhelming for her reduced team, and reinforcements would make any direct engagement impossible. She signaled Santos to proceed with the rockslide while she gathered final documentation. The mountain groaned, and Elena heard the first sounds of shifting rock as Santos's team used concentrated rifle fire to destabilize the already weakened cliff face above the southern pass. The convoy soldiers immediately reacted to the sound. but they assumed it was natural mountain activity rather than deliberately initiated by enemy action. Elena watched through her scope as tons of granite broke loose from the cliff face and crashed down into the narrow pass, creating an effective barrier that would prevent vehicles from leaving the gorge. The timing was perfect, but Elena knew the real challenge was just beginning. The convoy commander immediately began issuing orders for his soldiers to investigate the rockslide and clear an alternative route. Elena counted at least 30 soldiers moving toward the blocked pass, leaving the supply trucks more lightly defended, but still protected by the APCs. This was Elena's opportunity. She activated her radio and whispered urgently, "All units, execute harassment fire. Keep them focused on the ridgelines while I complete documentation." The coordinated rifle fire from her team's positions drew immediate response from the convoy's heavy weapons. Elena used the distraction to move even closer to the supply trucks. Now less than 30 meters from containers that could kill thousands of people if they reached their intended destination. What Elena saw next confirmed her worst fears about the conspiracy. One of the convoy soldiers was wearing a uniform she recognized as belonging to the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. An American soldier was helping transport chemical weapons to terrorists, which meant the betrayal reached deeper into the military hierarchy than anyone had suspected. Elena photographed the American soldier and tried to get clear images of his name tape and rank insignia. This evidence would be crucial for identifying how the conspiracy had penetrated U.S. military units and potentially preventing future operations. Her radio suddenly erupted with Rodriguez's urgent voice. "Bravo 1, those reinforcements are early. I count 4 vehicles now, and they're moving fast toward your position." Elena realized she was about to be trapped between the original convoy and reinforcements that would overwhelm her team's ability to provide covering fire. She had to complete her mission and withdraw immediately, but the evidence she was gathering could be the key to preventing future terrorist attacks. The American soldier in Chemical Corps uniform was directing the handling of specific containers, pointing to markings that Elena couldn't read from her position. She began moving closer, knowing that each step increased her risk of detection, but understanding that the intelligence she might gather could save countless lives. Suddenly, the soldier turned in her direction, and Elena found herself looking directly into the face of Major Robert Kane, a Chemical Corps officer she had worked with during training exercises 18 months earlier. Kane was not just any American military member involved in the conspiracy. He was someone Elena knew personally. Kane's eyes widened with recognition and shock. For a moment, both soldiers stared at each other across 30 meters of broken ground, processing the implications of their unexpected encounter. Then Kane reached for his sidearm while shouting warnings to the convoy soldiers around him. Elena reacted with instincts honed by 3 years of combat experience. She brought her machine gun up and fired a controlled burst that forced Kane to dive for cover while alerting every soldier in the convoy to her position. The element of surprise was lost, but Elena had gathered evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. The convoy's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Heavy weapons fire converged on Elena's position from multiple directions, forcing her to abandon her observation point and begin a fighting withdrawal toward her team's rally point. Bullets sparked off rocks around her as she bounded from cover to cover, using every technique she had learned from movement under fire. Santos's voice crackled through Elena's radio with urgent intensity. "Elena, we can see your position. Suppressing targets to your east." Elena could hear her team's concentrated rifle fire drawing some of the pressure away from her position, but she was still pinned down by fire from the APCs and at least a dozen infantry positions. The digital camera and recordings in her pack represented evidence that could prevent terrorist attacks, but only if she could survive to deliver them. The sound of approaching vehicles reminded Elena that reinforcements were arriving that would make her situation impossible. She had to reach her team's position before being completely surrounded, but the open ground between her current cover and safety was swept by multiple machine gun positions. Elena made a tactical decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of trying to evade the overwhelming firepower directed at her position, she decided to use her machine gun to create enough chaos and confusion to allow her team to escape, while she covered their withdrawal. She radioed her team with final instructions. All units, prepare for immediate extraction to the northern ridgeline. I'm going to provide covering fire to mask your movement. Santos's response was immediate and horrified. Elena, that's suicide. We're not leaving you. Elena felt a moment of profound clarity about her responsibilities as a leader and as a soldier. Her team carried evidence that could prevent terrorist attacks, but only if they survived to deliver it. Her sacrifice might save not just her soldiers' lives, but potentially thousands of innocent civilians who would never know how close they had come to a chemical weapons attack. Maria, that's an order. Get the evidence out and make sure that truth comes out. Rodriguez has the rally point coordinates for extraction. Elena positioned her machine gun to provide maximum coverage of the approaches to her team's positions, and began sustained suppressive fire against the convoy forces. The M249 bucked against her shoulder as she sent burst after burst toward enemy positions, forcing soldiers to seek cover and disrupting their ability to engage her withdrawing team. The machine gun's sustained fire drew concentrated response from every heavy weapon in the convoy. Elena's position became the focal point for massive volumes of incoming fire, but she maintained her suppressive fire while tracking her team's movement through her peripheral vision. Santos, Kim, Foster, and Rodriguez were bounding between covered positions, moving toward the extraction route Elena had designated. Their movement was partially masked by the confusion Elena's aggressive fire was creating among the convoy forces, but they were still under intermittent fire from multiple directions. Elena watched Rodriguez stumble and fall, clutching his wounded leg in addition to his earlier arm injury. Without hesitation, Santos and Kim moved back to help him, exposing themselves to additional fire while dragging the wounded corporal toward cover. The sight of her soldiers risking their lives for each other filled Elena with fierce pride and determination. These were the people she had sworn to protect, and their courage under fire demonstrated why her sacrifice was worthwhile. Elena shifted her fire to cover Santos and Kim as they helped Rodriguez reach a more defensible position. Her ammunition was running low, but she maintained steady pressure on the convoy forces while her team continued their withdrawal. Major Kane's voice suddenly boomed across the gorge through a megaphone. Sergeant Vasquez, you're surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now, and your soldiers will be allowed to withdraw safely. Elena almost laughed at the absurdity of the offer. Kane was involved in trafficking chemical weapons to terrorists, and his promise of safe passage for her soldiers was worthless. Instead of responding, Elena concentrated her fire on the position where Kane's voice had originated, forcing him to seek cover. Her radio crackled with Colonel Blackwood's urgent voice. Bravo 1, extraction helicopters are en route to your position. Estimated arrival in 12 minutes. Can you hold your position? Elena looked at her remaining ammunition and assessed the tactical situation. 12 minutes was an eternity under sustained heavy weapons fire, but it was also the first hope of extraction her team had received since the mission began. Negative on holding current position, Elena responded while changing ammunition. But I can keep them busy while my team reaches the extraction zone. Elena could see her soldiers reaching more defensible positions on the northern ridgeline, but they were still within range of the convoy's heavy weapons. She needed to maintain pressure on the enemy forces until extraction arrived, which meant sustaining her one-woman assault against overwhelming odds. The machine gun was becoming almost too hot to handle from sustained fire, But Elena continued engaging targets while moving between covered positions to avoid being pinned down by return fire. Her movement drew attention away from her team while demonstrating that the convoy still faced active resistance. Suddenly, explosions erupted throughout the convoy's position as fast-moving aircraft appeared overhead. Elena looked up to see a 10 attack aircraft conducting close air support runs against the chemical weapons convoy. Colonel Blackwood's voice came through the radio with obvious relief. Bravo 1, close air support is engaging the convoy. Maintain your position and prepare for helicopter extraction. Elena watched in amazement as the A-10S systematically destroyed the convoy's heavy weapons and vehicles with precision strikes. The chemical weapons containers were carefully avoided, but the aircraft eliminated the convoy's ability to transport the weapons or engage Elena's team. The surviving convoy soldiers, including Major Kane, began surrendering as their position became untenable. Elena maintained overwatch on the prisoners while her team regrouped at the extraction point, but the immediate threat had been neutralized by air support. The sound of approaching helicopters announced the arrival of extraction aircraft, along with what appeared to be a full company of special operations soldiers who rappelled into the gorge to secure the chemical weapons and process the prisoners. Elena finally allowed herself to believe that her team had survived and that the evidence they had gathered would lead to accountability for the conspiracy that had nearly gotten them killed. As she made her way toward the extraction zone, Elena reflected on the choices that had brought her to this moment. Her refusal to follow orders that would have gotten her soldiers killed had led to uncovering a conspiracy involving chemical weapons trafficking. Her decision to take tactical command when faced with impossible orders had saved not just her team's lives, but potentially thousands of innocent lives that would have been lost in terrorist attacks. Colonel Blackwood met Elena at the extraction site, a tall woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Her first words confirmed what Elena had begun to suspect about the scope of the conspiracy. Sergeant Vasquez, the evidence your team gathered has already led to arrests at the highest levels of military and intelligence leadership. Major Kane is talking, and his information is exposing a network of corruption that reaches into multiple government agencies. Elena looked at her soldiers, all of whom had survived the mission despite being targeted for elimination by their own command structure. Rodriguez was receiving medical treatment for his wounds, but he would recover fully. Santos, Kim, and Foster were exhausted but uninjured, and all carried themselves with the quiet pride of soldiers who had accomplished something important under impossible conditions. "Colonel, what happens now?" Elena asked. Blackwood's expression was serious but hopeful. "Now we make sure that everyone responsible for this conspiracy faces justice, and we implement changes to prevent anything like this from happening again. Your team's actions have prevented a terrorist attack and exposed corruption that could have led to many more such attacks." As Elena and her team were lifted out of the gorge by helicopter, she looked down at the remains of the convoy and felt a sense of completion. The mission had not gone according to any plan, but it had achieved something more important than any official objective. It had prevented mass casualties and exposed enemies who had hidden among friends. Elena Vasquez had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against corruption and betrayal within one's own ranks. Her machine gun fire had indeed turned the tide, not just of a single engagement, but of a conspiracy that threatened innocent lives around the world. The sergeant who had called retreat to save her soldiers had become the leader who advanced to save thousands of people she would never meet. In Elena's mind, that transformation defined what it truly meant to be a soldier. 6 months after the Cope Montenegro incident, Elena stood before a joint congressional committee in a windowless hearing room deep within the Capitol building. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the polished table, where 12 senators and representatives sat with thick folders containing classified documents that detailed the chemical weapons conspiracy she had helped expose. The room smelled of old coffee and the particular tension that accompanied high-stakes political proceedings. Senator Margaret Hayes, the committee chairwoman, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had spent decades navigating Washington politics. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her eyes as she studied. Elena's service record spread across the table before her. "Sergeant Vasquez, now Staff Sergeant Vasquez," Hayes began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms where careers were made and destroyed. "Your actions in Montenegro resulted in the arrest of 17 military personnel, the resignation of 2 generals, and the complete restructuring of chemical weapons oversight protocols. Do you understand the magnitude of what your decision to disobey orders has accomplished?" Elena maintained her rigid posture in the witness chair, her dress blue uniform bearing the new ribbons that had been awarded following the mission. The bronze star with V device for valor sat among decorations that told the story of a soldier who had served with distinction in multiple combat deployments. But Elena knew that the real measure of her service would be determined by how history judged the choices she had made in that mountain gorge. "Ma'am, I understand that my actions had consequences beyond what I anticipated at the time. My primary concern was preventing the loss of American lives and stopping chemical weapons from reaching terrorist organizations." Representative James Morrison, a former Marine officer whose own service in Iraq gave him credibility on military matters, consulted his notes before speaking. "Staff Sergeant, your testimony indicates that you made the decision to assume tactical command and withdraw your unit based on your assessment that the mission parameters were compromised. Can you walk us through the specific factors that led to that assessment?" Elena had rehearsed this moment countless times during the months of investigations and debriefings that had followed the Montenegro operation. The question touched on the heart of military discipline and the circumstances under which soldiers could legitimately refuse orders from superior officers. "Sir, the mission briefing indicated we were conducting interdiction of weapons-grade materials, but the tactical deployment suggested a defensive operation with no provision for withdrawal or extraction. When the convoy we encountered demonstrated capabilities far beyond what intelligence had indicated, and when my communications with command resulted in orders to maintain untenable positions against overwhelming odds, I concluded that the mission had been compromised either through intelligence failure or deliberate deception." Senator William Crawford, whose reputation for prosecutorial questioning had earned him the nickname "the Hammer" among Washington insiders, leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone preparing to spring a carefully planned trap. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez, are you familiar with Article 90 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice regarding willful disobedience of superior commissioned officers?" Elena felt the temperature in the room seem to drop as Crawford's question highlighted the legal jeopardy that had shadowed her actions since Montenegro. "Yes, sir. I am familiar with the article and understand that willful disobedience of lawful orders is a serious offense under military law." Crawford smiled with the cold precision of a politician who had found the vulnerability he was seeking. "Then you understand that your decision to assume command and withdraw your unit constituted a clear violation of direct orders from your commanding officer, Lieutenant Chen." Elena met Crawford's gaze steadily, knowing that this moment would define not just her own future, but potentially the precedent for how future soldiers might respond to similarly compromised orders. "Sir, I understand that my actions constituted disobedience of Lieutenant Chen's orders. However, I believed then and continue to believe that those orders were not lawful under the circumstances." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sounds of traffic filtering through the building's thick walls. Elena could see committee members exchanging glances that suggested her answer had touched on legal and ethical complexities that extended far beyond simple military discipline. Representative Sarah Kim, whose background as a military prosecutor gave her unique insight into the intersection of military law and operational necessity, leaned forward with obvious interest. Staff Sergeant, can you explain the basis for your assessment that Lieutenant Chen's orders were unlawful? Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either vindicate her actions or condemn her to court-martial and imprisonment. Ma'am, orders that require soldiers to remain in positions that serve no tactical purpose while exposing them to certain death may constitute unlawful orders under the principle that military personnel cannot be required to commit suicide in service of objectives that serve no legitimate military purpose. Crawford's expression darkened as Elena's response highlighted the legal complexity of her situation. Staff Sergeant, are you suggesting that soldiers can simply decide for themselves when orders are lawful or unlawful based on their personal assessment of tactical situations? Elena felt the weight of the question and understood that Crawford was trying to establish a precedent that would discourage future soldiers from questioning orders, regardless of circumstances. No, sir. I am suggesting that soldiers have a responsibility to refuse orders that violate the law of armed conflict or that serve no legitimate military purpose while unnecessarily endangering American lives. Senator Hayes intervened before Crawford could continue his line of questioning. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, let's focus on the specific circumstances of your mission. You testified that you suspected the weapons convoy was not what it appeared to be. Can you elaborate on what led you to that conclusion? Elena consulted her notes, though the details of that morning were burned into her memory with crystalline clarity. Ma'am, several factors indicated that the mission briefing did not reflect the actual situation. The convoy's composition and capabilities exceeded intelligence estimates by significant margins. The handling procedures I observed suggested chemical or biological weapons rather than conventional materials. Most importantly, the tactical deployment of our unit served no apparent military purpose other than to place us in a position where we could observe activities that someone wanted to remain secret. Representative Morrison looked up from documents he had been reviewing. Staff Sergeant, your report indicates that you identified Major Robert Kane as an American military officer involved in the weapons trafficking operation. How did this discovery affect your assessment of the situation? Elena felt anger building as she recalled seeing Kane's face among the convoy personnel. Sir, identifying an American Chemical Corps officer participating in the transport of weapons to terrorist organizations confirmed that the conspiracy reached into our own military hierarchy. It became clear that our unit had been positioned not to intercept those weapons, but to serve as witnesses who could be eliminated to protect the operation. Senator Crawford was reviewing classified documents that Elena couldn't see from her position. Staff Sergeant, classified intelligence indicates that Major Kane was actually conducting an undercover operation to infiltrate the weapons trafficking network. Are you aware of this possibility? Elena felt confusion mixing with her carefully maintained composure. Sir, I was not briefed about any undercover operations, and Major Kane's actions during the engagement suggested hostile intent toward our unit. Hayes consulted with committee staff before continuing her questioning. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, subsequent investigation has revealed that multiple intelligence operations were running simultaneously in the Montenegro area, some of which conflicted with others. It's possible that your unit became involved in a complex situation where not all participants were aware of the complete operational picture. The implications of Hayes' statement hit Elena like a physical blow. If Kane had been conducting a legitimate undercover operation, then her interference might have compromised an important intelligence mission. But the evidence she had gathered suggested weapons trafficking that posed immediate threats to civilian populations. Representative Kim seemed to sense Elena's confusion and addressed the apparent contradiction. Staff Sergeant, regardless of the complexity of the intelligence operations involved, Your unit documented evidence of chemical weapons being transported under suspicious circumstances. That evidence has led to arrests and the recovery of weapons that could have caused mass casualties. Do you believe your actions were justified given those results? Elena felt the weight of moral judgment settling on her shoulders. Ma'am, I believe that preventing chemical weapons from reaching terrorist organizations justifies the risks my unit took, regardless of what other operations might have been compromised. Crawford was not satisfied with Elena's response. Staff Sergeant, are you saying that enlisted personnel should make strategic decisions about competing intelligence operations based on their limited understanding of complex situations? Elena understood that Crawford was trying to establish that her actions had been inappropriate regardless of their results. Sir, I am saying that soldiers have a responsibility to prevent weapons of mass destruction from being used against innocent people, even when that responsibility conflicts with orders that serve unclear purposes. The hearing room door opened, and a committee aide approached Senator Hayes with an urgent message. Hayes read the document quickly, her expression growing more serious as she processed whatever information it contained. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received classified intelligence that directly relates to Staff Sergeant Vasquez's testimony. I'm calling a brief recess while the committee reviews this new information. As the committee members filed out of the hearing room, Elena remained seated at the witness table, wondering what new development could affect her case. The months since Montenegro had been filled with investigations, interviews, and legal proceedings that had consumed her life, while the full scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered continued to unfold. Santos approached Elena during the recess, her own dress uniform bearing the ribbons that marked her as one of the heroes of the Montenegro operation. Elena, how are you holding up? Elena felt exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. Maria, I'm starting to wonder if we did the right thing. What if Kane really was undercover? What if we compromised a legitimate operation? Santos sat down beside her friend, her expression reflecting the same doubts that had been plaguing Elena for months. Elena, we prevented chemical weapons from reaching terrorists. Whatever else happened, that was the right thing to do. Elena looked around the sterile hearing room and felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the political and legal implications of her actions. Maria, what if the price of doing the right thing was destroying innocent people's careers and compromising national security operations? Before Santos could respond, the committee members returned to the hearing room with expressions that suggested the new intelligence had significantly changed their perspective on Elena's case. Senator Hayes called the hearing back to order with obvious tension in her voice. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, the intelligence we've just reviewed indicates that the chemical weapons your unit documented were not the only weapons involved in the trafficking operation. Additional evidence has emerged suggesting that Major Kane was indeed conducting an undercover operation, but that his mission had been compromised by hostile intelligence services. Elena felt her understanding of the Montenegro situation shifting. Once again, ma'am, are you saying that Major Kane was legitimately working for U.S. intelligence? Hayes consulted her classified documents before responding. I'm saying that the situation was considerably more complex than any of the participants understood at the time. Major Kane was attempting to identify the source of chemical weapons that were being stolen from U.S. stockpiles and sold to terrorist organizations. Your unit's intervention prevented one shipment from reaching its destination, but it also exposed Kane's cover and compromised ongoing efforts to identify other participants in the trafficking network. Representative Morrison leaned forward with obvious concern. Staff Sergeant, the intelligence community has now confirmed that at least 12 separate chemical weapons transactions were prevented as a result of information gathered during your mission. The conspiracy you helped expose was far more extensive than initially believed. Elena felt relief mixing with continued confusion. Sir, are you saying that our actions had positive results, despite potentially compromising Major Kane's operation. Crawford's expression suggested he was not satisfied with the direction the hearing was taking. Staff Sergeant, the fact that your insubordination had positive consequences does not justify your violation of military discipline. Soldiers cannot be allowed to pick and choose which orders they follow based on their personal assessment of complex situations. Elena understood that Crawford was articulating a position that many in the military hierarchy shared. Allowing soldiers to question orders based on incomplete information could undermine the chain of command that was essential to military effectiveness. Senator Hayes seemed to be weighing competing considerations as she prepared her next question. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, if you found yourself in a similar situation today, with the benefit of everything you've learned about the complexity of intelligence operations, would you make the same decisions? Elena considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would likely determine the precedent her case would establish for future soldiers facing similar dilemmas. Ma'am, I would still prioritize preventing weapons of mass destruction from reaching terrorist organizations, but I would also attempt to gather more information about potential intelligence operations before taking action. Representative Kim seemed satisfied with Elena's response. Staff Sergeant, your actions demonstrate the kind of moral courage that has defined the best traditions of American military service. While the complexity of the situation created unintended consequences, your primary achievement was preventing mass casualties among innocent civilians. Crawford was not ready to concede the point. Representative Kim, moral courage does not excuse violations of military discipline. If we allow soldiers to disobey orders whenever they believe those orders might be wrong, we undermine the entire basis of military command structure. Elena felt the tension in the room as committee members grappled with competing values that were both essential to military effectiveness. Discipline and obedience were crucial for coordinated military action, but moral courage and independent judgment were equally important for preventing atrocities and protecting innocent lives. Hayes seemed to recognize that the committee was approaching a decision point that would define how Elena's case would be resolved. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, do you have any final statement you would like to make to this committee? Elena stood and came to attention, feeling the weight of military tradition and personal conviction as she prepared to speak words that would conclude months of investigation and soul-searching. Ma'am, I joined the military to protect innocent people and to serve causes larger than myself. In Montenegro, I was faced with a choice between following orders that would have resulted in the deaths of my soldiers and a successful transport of chemical weapons to terrorists, or taking actions that risked my career but might save lives. I chose to prioritize the protection of innocent life, and I would make the same choice again under similar circumstances. Elena paused, looking at each committee member as she concluded her statement. I understand that military discipline requires soldiers to follow lawful orders, even when those orders involve personal risk. But I also believe that soldiers have a higher obligation to refuse orders that serve no legitimate military purpose while enabling harm to innocent people. The chemical weapons we prevented from reaching terrorists could have killed thousands of civilians who will never know how close they came to a horrible death. That knowledge gives me peace with whatever consequences my actions might bring. The hearing room fell silent as Elena's words settled over the committee members. She could see in their faces the recognition that her case touched on fundamental questions about the relationship between military discipline and moral responsibility that had no easy answers. Senator Hayes consulted with her colleagues before addressing Elena with obvious respect. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, this committee will be making recommendations about your case to the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those recommendations will consider both the positive results of your actions and the important precedent your case might establish for future military personnel facing similar moral dilemmas. Elena felt a sense of completion as the formal hearing concluded, though she knew that the final resolution of her case might still be months away. The months since Montenegro had taught her that doing the right thing often involved accepting uncertainty about consequences and trusting that truth would eventually prevail over political expediency. As Elena left the hearing room, Santos walked beside her through the marble corridors of the Capitol building. "Elena, whatever happens with the committee's recommendations, you saved lives and exposed corruption that could have led to terrorist attacks. That's something to be proud of regardless of what politicians decide." Elena felt gratitude for her friend's support, but also a sense of melancholy about the personal cost of the choices she had made. "Maria, I've learned that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, especially when it involves questioning people and institutions you've trusted your entire career." Santos nodded with understanding born from shared experience. "Elena, the fact that it doesn't feel good is probably proof that you did it for the right reasons. People who enjoy destroying careers and challenging authority usually aren't the ones you want making moral decisions in crisis situations." As they emerged from the Capitol building into the bright Washington sunshine, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from a mountain gorge in Montenegro to a congressional hearing room in the heart of American political power. The decisions she had made during a few critical hours had defined not just her own future, but potentially the precedent for how future soldiers would navigate the complex intersection of military discipline and moral responsibility. Elena Vasquez had learned that leadership sometimes meant accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical objectives. Her machine gun fire had indeed turned the tide, but the battle for accountability and justice was far from over. 2 years later, Elena stood in the crisp morning air of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, watching a new class of soldiers practice tactical movements across the training ground she now called home. The gold oak leaf on her collar marked her recent promotion to major, a rank that had come with responsibilities she never could have imagined during her days as an enlisted soldier in Montenegro. The counterintelligence training academy had been established as a direct result of the chemical weapons conspiracy Elena had helped expose. Now she served as the primary instructor for a curriculum that taught military personnel how to identify and respond to threats that came from within their own command structure. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres approached Elena's position with the measured stride of someone who had spent decades balancing competing demands of military protocol and practical necessity. Torres had been assigned to oversee the academy after her own experience uncovering corruption in military procurement had demonstrated the need for officers who understood how to navigate the complex world of internal threats. "Major Vasquez, I've just received word from the Pentagon. The final report on the Montenegro conspiracy has been declassified, and the results are more significant than we anticipated." Elena turned from watching her students to face Torres, noting the mixture of satisfaction and concern in her commander's expression. The investigation had continued long after Elena's congressional testimony, reaching into areas of government and military hierarchy that had shocked even seasoned investigators. "What did they find, Colonel?" Torres handed Elena a thick folder, bearing classification markings that indicated the document contained some of the most sensitive intelligence the military possessed. They found that the chemical weapons trafficking operation involved personnel from 12 different government agencies, including people we never suspected. Elena opened the folder and began reading names that included generals, intelligence officials, and even members of Congress who had been providing information to hostile foreign services. The scope of the betrayal was staggering, reaching into the highest levels of American national security apparatus. "How many people have been arrested?" Torres consulted her own notes with the precision of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials about complex investigations. 47 arrests so far, with more expected as the investigation continues. The chemical weapons your team documented in Montenegro were just one shipment in a network that had been operating for over 5 years. Elena felt a mix of vindication and horror as she processed the implications. Her decision to disobey orders and document the convoy's activities had exposed a conspiracy that dwarfed anything she had imagined during those desperate hours in the mountain gorge. What about Major Kane? Was he really working undercover? Torres's expression grew more complex as she addressed the question that had haunted Elena since her congressional testimony. Kane was conducting a legitimate intelligence operation, but he had been compromised months before your encounter. The foreign services knew about his mission and were using him to identify American personnel who might interfere with their operations. Elena realized that Kane's presence with the convoy had been part of an elaborate trap designed to eliminate both the undercover operation and any witnesses who might report what they had seen. Her team's intervention had saved not just civilian lives, but potentially Kane's life as well. The sound of gunfire from the training range interrupted their conversation as Elena's students practiced the tactical scenarios she had developed based on real-world experiences. The curriculum included everything from identifying compromised orders to documenting evidence under combat conditions. Sergeant First Class David Martinez approached their position with the confident bearing of a student who had excelled in every aspect of the training program. Martinez had volunteered for the academy after his own unit had encountered suspicious orders during a deployment in Syria. Major Vasquez, we've completed the scenario you designed based on the Montenegro situation. The students successfully identified the compromised mission parameters and documented evidence while conducting a tactical withdrawal. Elena felt pride in her students' performance, knowing that the skills they were learning might prevent future soldiers from facing the impossible choices she had encountered. What was their biggest challenge, Sergeant? Martinez considered the question carefully. Ma'am, the hardest part for most students is accepting that their own command structure might be compromised. They want to believe that orders from superior officers are always legitimate and serve valid military purposes. Elena understood the psychological challenge Martinez was describing. Military training emphasized trust in the chain of command, which made it difficult for soldiers to recognize when that trust was being exploited by hostile forces. Torres addressed Martinez directly. Sergeant, how are the students responding to the ethical components of the training? Martinez's expression reflected the complexity of teaching soldiers to balance military discipline with moral responsibility. Colonel, most students understand the importance of preventing weapons of mass destruction from reaching terrorists, but they struggle with the idea of disobeying direct orders based on their own judgment. Elena had wrestled with the same issues while developing the academy's curriculum. How do you teach soldiers to question authority without undermining the discipline that makes military operations possible? The answer required nuanced thinking that didn't come naturally to people trained to follow orders without hesitation. The key is teaching them to recognize the difference between legitimate military objectives and orders that serve hidden agendas. Elena explained to Martinez. Soldiers need to understand that their ultimate loyalty is to protecting innocent life and defending constitutional principles, not to individual officers who might be compromised. Torres nodded approvingly. Major Vasquez, your curriculum has been so successful that other military academies are requesting permission to implement similar programs. The Joint Chiefs are considering making counterintelligence awareness mandatory for all military personnel above the rank of sergeant. Elena felt the weight of influence she had never sought. Her actions in Montenegro had not only exposed a specific conspiracy, but had changed how the military thought about internal threats and the responsibilities of individual soldiers. A communications specialist approached their group with an urgent message that had arrived through secure channels. Torres read the document quickly, her expression growing more serious as she processed the information. Major Vasquez, we have a developing situation that requires immediate attention. Intelligence has identified a potential conspiracy involving military personnel in Eastern Europe and the patterns match what you encountered in Montenegro. Elena felt familiar tension building as she realized that the lessons learned from her experience were about to be tested in a new crisis. What kind of conspiracy, Colonel? Torres consulted the classified message. American military advisors in Poland are reporting suspicious orders that would place them in isolated positions with limited extraction options. The orders allegedly come from legitimate channels, but the tactical deployment makes no strategic sense. Elena recognized the pattern immediately. American personnel were being positioned where they could observe activities that someone wanted to remain secret, with mission parameters that would likely result in their elimination if they discovered too much. Do we know who's behind the orders? Torres showed Elena the intelligence summary. The orders appear to originate from General William Harrison, who's been serving as liaison to NATO command. But Harrison has been under investigation for financial irregularities that might indicate foreign influence. Elena felt the familiar chill of recognition that had defined her experience in Montenegro. Another American general was potentially involved in operations that would sacrifice American lives to protect illegal activities. Colonel, are we authorized to intervene? Torres smiled grimly. Major, that's exactly why this academy exists. You're being deployed to Poland with a team of specialists to assess the situation and provide guidance to the military advisors who might be walking into a trap. Elena felt purpose crystallizing as she prepared for a mission that would test everything she had learned about identifying and countering internal threats. The skills she had developed through bitter experience in Montenegro would now be used to prevent other soldiers from facing similar betrayal. Martinez volunteered immediately. Major, request permission to join the mission. This is exactly the kind of situation our training was designed to address. Elena looked at the young sergeant and saw her own determination from 2 years earlier. Granted, Sergeant. But understand that we might be facing people who consider American military personnel expendable assets in pursuit of their own agendas. Torres handed Elena deployment orders that had been prepared with unusual speed, suggesting that senior command considered the Poland situation an immediate priority. Major, you have full authority to take whatever actions you deem necessary to protect American personnel and gather evidence of any conspiracy you might encounter. Elena accepted the orders with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own judgment in situations where official channels might be compromised. The frightened sergeant who had questioned orders in a mountain gorge had become a major who was trusted to prevent similar conspiracies from succeeding. As Elena prepared for deployment to Poland, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from an impossible tactical situation to a position where she could prevent other soldiers from facing similar betrayal. Her machine gun fire in Montenegro had indeed turned the tide, not just of a single engagement, but of how the American military approached the threat of internal conspiracy. Elena Vasquez was no longer just a soldier following orders. She had become a guardian against the enemies who hid among friends, and she was ready for whatever challenges that role might bring. The abandoned industrial complex outside Warsaw stretched across the Polish countryside like a monument to Soviet-era manufacturing ambitions. Major Elena Vasquez crouched behind rusted machinery, watching through night vision equipment as American military advisors moved through what appeared to be a routine reconnaissance mission. But Elena's trained eye recognized the tactical deployment pattern that had nearly gotten her killed in Montenegro 3 years earlier. Sergeant Martinez whispered urgently into his radio from a position 30 meters to Elena's left. Overwatch. American personnel are being positioned in isolated sectors with no mutual support. This matches the Montenegro pattern exactly. Elena felt familiar anger building as she watched 12 American soldiers being maneuvered into positions where they could observe activities while becoming vulnerable to elimination if they discovered too much. The conspiracy she had thought was defeated was apparently still active. adapting its methods but maintaining its willingness to sacrifice American lives. Her earpiece crackled with the voice of General Patricia Reynolds, who was coordinating the counter-operation from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Reynolds had been personally selected by the Joint Chiefs to oversee efforts to identify and neutralize internal threats following the Montenegro investigation. Phoenix 1, what's your assessment of the tactical situation? Elena activated her transmitter while maintaining visual contact with the American advisors below. General, 12 U.S. personnel are being deployed in a pattern designed to maximize their observation capabilities while minimizing their survival chances if hostile forces are present. The mission parameters show all the characteristics of a setup operation. Elena could see through her scope that the advisors were carrying equipment for documenting industrial facilities, suggesting they had been told to gather evidence about abandoned chemical production capabilities. But their positioning and the absence of proper security protocols indicated they were actually being prepared for elimination. Martinez's voice carried tension as he reported new developments. Major, I'm observing movement in the facility. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north, and they're not displaying friendly identification. Elena shifted her scope toward the approaching vehicles and felt her blood chill as she recognized the same tactical signatures she had encountered in Montenegro. Heavily armed personnel in unmarked vehicles, moving with the precision of military units, but without any official identification. General Reynolds, we have hostile forces approaching the American positions. Request immediate authorization to intervene. Reynolds's response was immediate and decisive. Phoenix 1, you are authorized to take whatever action necessary to protect American personnel and gather intelligence about the conspiracy. All available assets are at your disposal. Elena felt the weight of command as she prepared to engage forces that might include American military personnel working for hostile intelligence services. The lessons learned from Montenegro had taught her that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones wearing friendly uniforms. She activated her team's tactical frequency. All Phoenix units, American personnel are about to be engaged by hostile forces. We're going in hot to extract our people and document whatever they were supposed to discover. Elena moved through the industrial complex with practiced stealth, using abandoned equipment and structural debris to mask her approach to the advisors' positions. Her team spread out to provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining the flexibility to respond to changing tactical situations. The first shots came from the approaching vehicles as they opened fire on the American advisors with the systematic precision of an execution squad. Elena watched through her scope as soldiers she was sworn to protect came under attack from an enemy that had planned their elimination in advance. Elena's response was immediate and devastating. Her rifle fire struck the lead vehicle's driver, causing it to crash into a concrete barrier while she shifted targets to engage dismounting personnel. The distinctive crack of her weapon echoed through the industrial complex as she began the process of turning hunters into hunted. Martinez and the other Phoenix team members engaged from multiple positions, creating crossfire that disrupted the attack on the American advisors while providing covering fire for their extraction. Elena could see the advisors responding to the sudden firefight with confused but professional tactical movement as they sought cover and tried to identify friend from foe. Elena's radio crackled with the voice of Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of the advisors who was taking fire from unknown assailants. Unknown friendly forces, this is Raven 6. What's your authority for intervention? Elena keyed her radio while engaging targets that were advancing on Walsh's position. Raven 6, this is Phoenix 1, Major Vasquez. You're under attack by hostile forces attempting to eliminate your unit. Follow my team's instructions for immediate extraction. The mention of Elena's name seemed to galvanize the advisors, several of whom had apparently heard about the Montenegro incident through military channels. Elena could see them beginning to coordinate their movement with her team's tactical guidance. But Elena's scope also revealed something that made her heart sink. Among the hostile forces attacking the advisors, she could identify at least 3 individuals wearing American military uniforms, with proper identification and equipment. The conspiracy had indeed survived Montenegro and had recruited new American personnel to serve hostile interests. Elena shifted her fire to engage the American traitors with the cold precision of someone who understood that mercy toward enemies wearing friendly uniforms would result in the deaths of loyal soldiers. Her shots were carefully placed to disable rather than kill, preserving the possibility of interrogation and prosecution. Martinez's voice carried urgency as he reported new tactical developments. Major reinforcements approaching from multiple directions. This was definitely a planned elimination operation. Elena could see additional vehicles converging on the Fandor industrial complex from 3 different approach routes, suggesting coordination and resources that exceeded anything a small conspiracy could muster. The scope of the operation indicated state-level sponsorship with extensive infiltration of American military communications. Phoenix teams were extracting American personnel now. Raven units follow Phoenix guidance to Rally Point Alpha. Move fast and stay low. Elena provided covering fire as the American advisors began withdrawing under her team's protection. The advisors moved with professional competence despite the confusion of being rescued from an attack they hadn't expected. During the extraction movement, Elena noticed that the advisors were carrying documentation and photographic equipment that suggested they had been gathering evidence about chemical weapons production facilities. The conspiracy wasn't just eliminating witnesses. It was destroying evidence of ongoing weapons production that violated international treaties. Captain Walsh reached Elena's position, carrying a camera and sample containers that indicated the advisors had discovered active chemical weapons manufacturing. Major Vasquez, we were documenting evidence of treaty violations when the attack began. This facility is producing banned chemical agents. Elena felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place as she realized the advisors had stumbled onto the source of the chemical weapons her team had intercepted in Montenegro. The conspiracy wasn't just trafficking existing weapons. It was actually producing new ones using American technology and expertise. Her radio erupted with General Reynolds' urgent voice. Phoenix 1. Satellite intelligence shows major hostile reinforcements approaching your position. Extraction helicopters are en route, but you need to hold your position for 12 minutes. Elena assessed her tactical situation against overwhelming odds with the calm calculation that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. 12 American advisors, 5 Phoenix team members, and herself against what appeared to be at least 40 hostile personnel with heavy weapons and armored vehicles. All units defensive positions around the main building. We hold here until extraction arrives. Phoenix teams establish overlapping fields of fire. Raven units prepare evidence for immediate transmission to higher command. The next 10 minutes tested every lesson Elena had learned about leadership under impossible circumstances. Her team and the advisors fought with desperate precision against forces that seemed determined to eliminate every witness to the chemical weapons production facility. Elena's machine gun fire swept the approaches to their defensive positions with the same deadly accuracy that had saved her team in Montenegro. But this time she was fighting not just for survival, but to preserve evidence that could prevent chemical weapons from being used in terrorist attacks around the world. The sound of approaching helicopters announced the arrival of extraction aircraft accompanied by close air support that quickly neutralized the remaining hostile forces. Elena watched through her scope as precision strikes eliminated the chemical production equipment while preserving enough evidence to support prosecutions. As Elena and the rescued advisors were lifted away from the industrial complex, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a frightened sergeant questioning orders to a major, leading operations that shaped international security. Her actions in Montenegro had prevented one terrorist attack, but the mission in Poland had exposed the infrastructure that could have enabled dozens of such attacks. General Reynolds met Elena at the secure airfield where the extraction helicopters had delivered her team and the evidence they had preserved. Reynolds's expression reflected both satisfaction with the mission's success and concern about the implications of what had been discovered. Major Vasquez, the evidence your team gathered has already led to the arrest of 12 American military personnel and the exposure of a chemical weapons production network that spans 4 countries. Your actions have prevented what intelligence estimates suggest could have been multiple terrorist attacks resulting in thousands of casualties. Elena looked at her team and the advisors they had rescued, all of whom carried themselves with the quiet pride of people who had accomplished something important under dangerous circumstances. General, the real heroes are the soldiers who were willing to document evidence even when they knew it might cost them their lives. Reynolds smiled with the satisfaction of a commander whose faith in her subordinates had been vindicated. Major, your techniques for identifying and countering internal conspiracies are being implemented throughout NATO forces. The counterintelligence training academy you established has become the model for protecting military personnel from betrayal by their own leadership. Elena felt a sense of completion as she realized that her machine gun fire in Montenegro had indeed turned the tide, not just of individual battles, but of how democratic militaries approach the threat of internal corruption and foreign infiltration. The sergeant who had called retreat to save her soldiers had become the major who advanced to save thousands of people she would never meet. Elena Vasquez had learned that true military leadership sometimes meant refusing to accept impossible situations and finding ways to protect innocent life even when official channels had been compromised. As Elena prepared for her return to Fort Bragg and the continued development of counterintelligence training programs, she understood that her greatest victory was not in any single engagement, but in the knowledge that future soldiers would be better prepared to recognize and resist the enemies who hid among friends. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.